Have you ever stopped to think about where ideas like liberty or equality really come from? I mean, we take them for granted now, don't we?
We really do.
But their history, it's actually pretty surprising. Lots of twists and turns you might not expect.
Definitely not a straight line.
Well, today, that's our deep dive. The French Revolution, a truly massive event. People call it the making of the modern world, and our sources really get into its roots and impact.
Right. So our mission today, if you like, is to dig into that. We're looking at the core ideas, the key people, and importantly, the unexpected consequences. How this whole thing rippled out way beyond France.
We're sifting through the layers then, from society's structure to the big ideas floating around.
Exactly. Peeling back the layers of French history leading up to it all.
Okay, so let's set the scene. France, before the storm breaks, we need to talk about the monarchy, Louis VI.
Yes, Louis VI came to the throne in 1774, a young guy, only 20, and married to Marie Antoinette.
And he walked into, well, a bit of a mess, financially speaking.
A huge mess is putting it mildly. An empty treasury. Seriously empty. Years and years of war had just drained everything.
Plus the court life, right? Versailles wasn't cheap.
Not even close. Extravagant doesn't cover it. And then, on top of that, France helped out the American colonies against Britain.
Which sounds good, maybe, but expensive.
Incredibly expensive. That added over 1 billion livres to the debt. And they already owed more than 2 billion.
Wow. So the country was essentially bankrupt.
Pretty much. And lenders knew it. They started charging like 10% interest on new loans.
Ouch. So more and more money just goes to paying interest.
Exactly. A bigger and bigger chunk of the budget, just servicing the debt. Unsustainable, really.
And this financial crisis is happening within this really old, rigid social structure. The old regime.
That's the backdrop. This feudal system, straight out of the Middle Ages, society divided into 3 estates.
3 estates. Okay, break that down.
So first estate, the clergy. Privileged just by birthright. No state taxes for them.
No taxes, and they collected their own.
The tithe took about 1/10 of the peasants' crops.
Right. And the second estate.
The nobility, also privileged by birth, also tax exempt.
Also tax exempt, and they had their own dues.
Feudal dues. Peasants had to work the nobles' fields, serve in their houses, join the army, build roads, all sorts of obligations, basically tied to the land and the lord.
Okay, so first and second estates, privileged, no taxes. That leaves the third estate.
Which is basically everyone else. About 90% peasants, though not many own their own land.
90%. But it wasn't just peasants.
No. You also had the rising middle class, big businessmen, merchants, lawyers, court officials, educated people, but they were all lumped together in the third estate.
And crucially,
they paid all the taxes, the direct taxes like the tail, a land tax, and indirect taxes on everyday things, salt, tobacco, you name it.
There's that image, isn't there? The spider and the fly.
Yes, that anonymous etching, it sums it up perfectly. The noblemen's, the spider, the peasants, the fly, caught in the web of the system.
So this crushing inequality, it wasn't just abstract unfairness. It meant real hardship.
A daily struggle to survive for most people. See, France's population had shot up. Went from maybe 23 million in 1715 to 28 million by 1789.
More mouths to feed.
Exactly. Demand for grain soared, but production just couldn't keep up. So the price of bread, the absolute staple food, it rose sharply.
But wages didn't rise with it.
Nope. Wages stagnated. So the gap between rich and poor just got wider and wider.
Leading to, what do the sources call them? Subsistence crises.
Yeah, times when just finding enough to eat was a crisis. And any bad weather drought, hail just made it 10 times worse.
Okay, so the pressure is building. Debt, inequality, hunger. Then comes a specific day. July 14th, 1789. Paris is on edge.
Completely on edge. Rumors flying everywhere. The king's ordered troops into the city. He's going to tell them to fire on us. You can feel the panic.
What happens?
Well, about 7,000 people, men and women, gather. They decide they need to defend themselves, form a people's militia.
So you need weapons.
Right. They start breaking into government buildings, looking for arms, and that leads them eventually to the Bastille.
The fortress prison. A symbol of the king's power.
A hated symbol of despotism, yeah. They thought they'd find ammunition stored there.
And did they?
Well, there was a fight. The commander of the Bastille was killed. They freed the prisoners, only 7 of them, surprisingly.
Only 7. Huh.
Yeah, but it wasn't really about the prisoners. It was the act itself. They tore the Bastille down, stone by stone, sold fragments as souvenirs.
Wow. So this was the moment. The point of no return.
Looking back, historians see it as the start of the chain reaction. The thing that really kicked everything off. leading eventually to the king's execution, though nobody saw that coming at the time, of course.
Okay, but you mentioned earlier peasants and workers had revolted before. What made this different? Why did it escalate?
That's a great point. Revolts happened, but they often lacked the means, the organization, the ideas for total change. That came from somewhere else.
The middle class, within the Third Estate.
Exactly. This group that had grown prosperous. Merchants, manufacturers making textiles, trading overseas, lawyers, administrators, educated people.
And they had different ideas about how society should work.
Fundamentally different. They believed your position shouldn't depend on who your parents were, but on your merit, your abilities.
Meritocracy, essentially.
Right. And they believed society should be based on freedom, equal laws, equal opportunities for everyone, a radical challenge to the old regime's core principles.
And these weren't just random thoughts. They were picking up on Enlightenment ideas. Philosophers.
Absolutely. Hugely influenced by them. You have John Locke arguing against the divine right of kings, saying people have inherent rights.
In his 2 treatises of government.
Correct. Then Jean-Jacques Rousseau with The Social Contract, proposing government based on an agreement, a contract between the people and their representatives, not divine will.
A social contract. Revolutionary stuff.
And Montesquieu, in The Spirit of the Laws, pushing for separation of powers, legislative, executive, judicial. Sound familiar?
Very. Like the model the U.S. adopted after independence.
Precisely. And these ideas weren't just locked away in books.
They were being discussed, debated.
Intensely.
Yeah.
In salons, coffee houses, spreading through pamphlets, newspapers. People read them aloud in groups, so even if you couldn't read, you heard these ideas.
So this intellectual energy is building.
Yeah.
And then Louis XVI needs more money. He plans more taxes.
Yes. And that news, hitting this already simmering pot of discontent and new ideas, it just fuels the outrage against the whole system of privileges.
Which leads us to another key date, May 5th, 1789, the Estates General Meeting.
The first time it had been called since 1614. A big deal. Louis needed their approval for new taxes.
How did that meeting work? I picture this grand hall in Versailles.
It was. The First Estate clergy sent 300 representatives, Second Estate nobility another 300. They got seats.
Okay. And the Third Estate?
They sent 600 representatives, more people, reflecting their size, right?
Yep.
But they had to stand at the back.
Stand, while the others sat.
Yep. And peasants, artisans, women, they weren't allowed in at all, though their grievances were brought in, supposedly, in about 40,000 letters.
40,000 letters. But the real flashpoint was the voting, wasn't it?
That was the spark. Traditionally, it was 1 vote per estate. So the clergy and nobility could always outvote the Third Estate 2-1.
Protecting their privileges.
Always. But the Third Estate, inspired by Rousseau and democratic ideals, demanded voting by head. 1 member, 1 vote.
Which would give them the majority.
Exactly. But the king refused. Absolutely rejected it.
So the Third Estate, they walked out.
They walked out in protest. And then, on June 20th, something incredible happened. The tennis court oath.
Right. Tell us about that.
They found themselves locked out of their usual meeting hall, so they gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court.
A tennis court? Seriously?
Seriously. And there, they declared themselves the National Assembly, the true representatives of the French nation. And they took an oath.
What do they swear?
They swore not to disband until they had written a constitution for France, a constitution that would limit the king's power.
That's a bold move. Who were their leaders at this point?
2 interesting figures emerge. Mirabeau, actually a nobleman himself, but he despised feudal privilege. A powerful speaker, published a journal.
A noble fighting for the Third Estate.
Yeah. And Abbé Sieyès, originally a priest. He wrote this incredibly influential pamphlet asking simply, what is the Third Estate? Basically arguing it was the nation.
So the National Assembly is drafting a constitution in Versailles.
Yeah.
What's happening in the rest of France? You mentioned turmoil earlier.
Absolute turmoil. Remember that bad harvest? It hit hard after a severe winter. Bread prices soared even higher. Bakeries were hoarding.
And people were angry.
Furious. Crowds of women especially, who'd queued for hours for bread, stormed bakeries. At the same time, rumors spread in the countryside.
More rumors.
Yeah, the great fear. Whispers that nobles were hiring bandits, brigands to destroy ripe crops.
Out of spite. Or to keep control.
Who knows what people believed? But the fear was real. Peasants grabbed pitchforks, attacked Chateau the Nobles' castles.
Looting grain, burning records.
Staining the documents that listed their feudal dues, trying to erase the symbols of their obligations. Many nobles just fled the country.
So the king is seeing this widespread revolt.
He can't ignore it. He finally formally recognizes the National Assembly, accepts that his power will be limited by a constitution.
And then comes that night in August 4th, 1789.
A truly momentous night. The Assembly passes decree after decree, basically dismantling the old order overnight.
What did they abolish?
The entire feudal system. Obligations, taxes, privileges. Clergy had to give up their privileges. Tithes were abolished.
And church lands.
Confiscated by the state, which brought in assets worth at least 2 billion livres. A huge shift in wealth and power.
Okay, so feudalism is gone. The king's power's checked. What does the new government look like? The Constitution is finished in 1791.
Yes, and France officially becomes a constitutional monarchy.
The goal being to limit the king's power.
Exactly. By separating powers, legislative, executive, judiciary, assigning them to different bodies, like Montesquieu suggested.
But who gets to participate? Is it truly democratic?
Well, there's the catch. The National Assembly was elected indirectly, and voting rights were very limited.
How limited?
You had to be an active citizen. That meant men over 25 who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days' wages for a laborer.
So not everyone.
Not by a long shot. Only about 4 million people out of 28 million qualified.
And everyone else. The poor, women.
Classified as passive citizens, no vote, and even to be an elector or an assembly member yourself, you had to be in the highest tax bracket, so still favoring the wealthy.
But the Constitution did start with something quite radical, didn't it? The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen.
Absolutely groundbreaking. It declared certain rights natural and inalienable.
Oddly.
Right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, equality before the law, rights belonging to everyone by birth that the state couldn't take away. The state's duty was to protect them.
A fundamental shift in thinking. But not everyone was convinced it went far enough. You mentioned Marat.
Jean-Paul Marat, yeah. In his newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, he pointed out that representing the people had basically been handed over to the rich.
He was skeptical.
Deeply. He warned that the poor wouldn't see real improvement through peaceful means alone, and that laws only last if people obey them. If they threw off the nobles, they'd eventually throw off the wealthy, too. A very prescient warning, really.
In communicating these big ideas, they used symbols, right, for people who couldn't read the pamphlets.
Yes, very effectively. Visual language was key. The broken chain, symbolizing freedom from bondage.
The red cap.
The Phrygian cap, worn by freed slaves in ancient Rome, became a symbol of liberty.
And the bundle of rods.
The fasces. One rod breaks easily, but a bundle is strong, meaning strength and unity.
And that eye in a triangle.
Symbolizing knowledge, radiating light, driving away the clouds of ignorance. Really powerful visual shorthand for these complex revolutionary ideals.
So France has a constitution, but things are still tense.
Very tense. Louis XVI might have signed it, but secretly he's negotiating with the King of Prussia. Other monarchs are getting nervous too.
They don't want revolution spreading.
Definitely not. They're planning to intervene, send troops. But before they can, in April 1792, the National Assembly declares war first on Prussia and Austria.
Wow. Why?
They saw it as a war of the people against the kings and aristocrats of Europe. Thousands of volunteers stream into Paris to join the army.
And that's where the anthem comes from.
The Marseillaise, yes. Written by Roger Hillel, sung by volunteers marching from Marseille, now France's national anthem.
But war brings hardship, doesn't it?
Always. Losses, economic problems. Men are away fighting, women are struggling to cope back home, and many people felt the revolution hadn't gone far enough.
Because the 1791 Constitution still favored the rich?
Exactly. Political rights were still limited. This fuels more discontent and the rise of political clubs. Places people could meet, discuss, plan action.
And the most famous club?
The Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, became incredibly influential.
Who are the Jacobins, typically?
Mostly the less prosperous folks. Small shopkeepers, artisans, shoemakers, bakers, servants, wage workers.
And they had a distinct look.
Yes, the sans-culottes. Literally those without knee breeches.
Knee breeches being what the nobles wore.
Right. So the Jacobins wore long, striped trousers like dock workers. A deliberate statement against the aristocracy, rejecting that old power structure visually.
Plus the red cap of liberty.
The men wore the red cap too, though women weren't allowed to wear it, interestingly.
Okay, so the Jacobins are gaining influence. Things are still unstable.
Yeah.
Then what happens?
Summer of 1792. The Jacobins plan an insurrection. Parisians are angry, food shortages, high prices again.
So they take action.
August 10th. They storm the Tuileries Palace, where the king is. There's fighting, the king's guards are killed, they take the king hostage.
the Assembly's response?
They vote to imprison the entire royal family, and then, crucially, they hold new elections.
With different voting rules this time.
Yes, all men 21 and over get the vote, regardless of wealth, a huge step towards universal male suffrage.
And this new assembly?
Called the Convention. Its first act, September 21st, 1792, abolish the monarchy entirely, declare France a republic.
Wow. So no more king. What happens to Louis?
He's tried for treason, found guilty, and on January 21st, 1793, he's executed publicly, guillotined in the Place de la Concorde.
And Marie Antoinette.
Same fate, a bit later, a really radical, brutal turn.
It certainly is. Which brings us to this next phase. If France is a republic fighting for liberty, how does that square with what came next, the period known as the Reign of Terror?
It's one of the great dark ironies, isn't it? From 1793 to 1794, Robespierre and the Jacobins are effectively in control, and they implement this policy of, well, terror.
Meaning?
Severe control, punishment for anyone deemed an enemy of the Republic.
Who qualified as an enemy?
Ex-nobles, clergy, members of rival political groups, even members of their own party if they disagreed too strongly.
What happened to them?
Arrested, imprisoned, tried by a revolutionary tribunal, and if found guilty.
The guillotine.
The guillotine became the symbol of this era. Swift, efficient, terrifyingly public, named after Dr. Guillotine, who actually proposed it as a more humane method.
Humane, right. And they tried to enforce equality in daily life, too.
In very direct ways. Price and wage controls. Rationing meat and bread.
Forcing peasants to sell grain at fixed prices.
Yes. And banning expensive white flour. Everyone had to eat equality bread, pain d'égalité made from whole wheat.
Even forms of address changed.
No more monsieur or madame. Everyone was citoyen or citoyenne. Citizen. Churches were shut, turned into barracks, offices, trying to erase the old symbols entirely.
It's such a paradox. This drive for equality, enforced by extreme state control and violence, were people debating this at the time?
Oh, absolutely. Starkly different views. You had journalists like Camille Desmoulins arguing, liberty is happiness, reason, equality, justice. He thought the endless guillotining was senseless, just creating more enemies.
But Robespierre saw it differently.
Completely. He gave this speech in early 1794. Called Terror, Nothing But Justice, Swift, Severe, and Inflexible. Said it was necessary to crush the enemies of liberty to solidify the Republic.
A necessary evil, in his view.
Essentially. But he pushed it so relentlessly, even his own supporters started saying, enough. We need moderation.
And eventually?
Eventually, the convention turned on him. He was arrested, convicted in July 1794. And the next day,
he met the guillotine himself.
The architect of the terror, consumed by it, a chilling end.
So Robespierre falls, the terror ends. What happens then? Who takes charge?
The pendulum swings back. The wealthier middle classes seize power again.
And they write another constitution.
Yes, and guess what?
Let me guess. Voting rights restricted again.
You got it. Denied the vote to people without property. Backtracking on that universal male suffrage.
What kind of government did this constitution create?
It set up 2 legislative councils, and they appointed an executive body called the Directory, 5 members.
5 directors. Why 5?
To prevent power concentrating in one person, like with Robespierre. A safeguard against dictatorship.
Did it work? Was it stable?
Not really. The directors constantly clashed with the legislative councils. Lots of political infighting, instability.
Which created an opening.
Exactly. This chaos, this weakness, paved the way for someone decisive to step in. A military leader. Napoleon Bonaparte.
Napoleon. We'll get back to him. But before we move on from the core revolutionary period, it wasn't just about politics and power shifts, was it? Everyday life changed. Society changed.
Profoundly. And we have to talk about the role of women. They were involved from the very start, weren't they?
Absolutely. Storing bakeries, participating in events.
Yeah.
Hoping things would improve for them, too.
Definitely. Most women in the Third Estate had hard lives, working as seamstresses, laundresses, sellers, servants. No access to education or training unless you were from a noble or very wealthy family.
And lower wages than men, of course.
Of course. Plus all the domestic work, cooking, cleaning, childcare, fetching water, queuing for that expensive bread.
So they organized, formed their own clubs.
They did. Around 60 women's clubs popped up across France, newspapers too. The most famous was the Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women.
What were their main demands?
Equal political rights. The right to vote, the right to be elected, to hold office. They knew their interests wouldn't be properly represented otherwise.
Did the revolutionary government do anything for women initially?
Actually, yes. Some significant early laws did improve things. State schools were created, and schooling became compulsory for girls.
That's big.
Huge. Fathers couldn't force daughters into marriage anymore. Marriage became a civil contract, registered by the state. Divorce was legalized for both men and women.
So more personal freedom, opportunities.
Yes, women could train for jobs, become artists, run small businesses, real gains in autonomy.
But the political rights
Yeah,
stalled.
it worse than stalled.
Hmm.
During the Reign of Terror, women's clubs were shut down, political activity banned, prominent women activists were arrested, some even executed.
Like Olympe de Gouges.
A key figure. She was outraged that the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen excluded women. Completely illogical to her.
So she wrote her own version.
In 1791, yes, the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen demanded equal rights in everything: liberty, property, security, resisting oppression, making laws, holding office.
What happened to her?
She criticized the Jacobin government, especially for closing the women's clubs. She was tried for treason, executed in 1793, a tragic silencing of a powerful voice.
And there were men actively arguing against women's rights.
Oh yes, that Jacobin politician, Charmet. He argued in 1793 that nature gave women domestic duties, motherhood, politics, agriculture, hunting, that was men's work, called women seeking political roles shameless.
So the fight for the vote continued long after the revolution.
For centuries, really, not just in France, but globally. French women only got the vote finally in 1946.
1946, wow, okay, another major social issue, slavery. How did the revolution tackle that?
It's another complex story. Remember those Caribbean colonies, Martinique, Guadeloupe, San Domingo? Huge sources of wealth.
Sugar, coffee, tobacco.
Exactly. But Europeans didn't want to go work the plantations there. So, from the 17th century, you get this brutal triangular slave trade.
Europe, Africa, the Americas.
French merchants sailed from ports like Nantes and Bordeaux to Africa, bought slaves branded, chained from local chiefs, packed them onto ships for the horrific journey across the Atlantic, sold them to plantation owners in the Caribbean.
And this fueled the French economy.
Immensely. Those port cities became very prosperous, but it was built entirely on slave labor.
Was there much criticism of this back in France?
Surprisingly little throughout the 18th century, even the National Assembly debating the rights of man. They hesitated.
Why?
Fear of upsetting the powerful businessmen who depended on the slave trade? Economics trumped ideals initially.
But eventually slavery was abolished.
Yes, the convention the Jacobin government finally did it in 1794. Legislated freedom for all slaves in French territories. A landmark moment.
Was it permanent?
Unfortunately, no. It was short-lived. 10 years later, Napoleon came along and reintroduced slavery.
Reintroduced it. Why?
Plantation owners basically argued their freedom included the right to enslave black Africans for economic gain. A terrible reversal.
So when was it finally abolished for good?
Not until 1848. Another long struggle.
It's striking how these ideals of liberty had such complicated applications. But let's talk about everyday life more broadly. Information flow changed dramatically. Censorship.
Yes, that was a huge shift. Before the revolution, under the old regime, everything written books, newspapers, plays had to be approved by the king's censors.
Total control.
Pretty much. But after the Bastille fell, one of the key laws abolished censorship. The Declaration of Rights proclaimed freedom of speech and expression as a natural right.
So suddenly, information floods out.
Exactly. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, printed pictures, they pour into French towns, spread to the countryside. Everyone's discussing the events, the changes.
Freedom of the press, essentially.
Yes. And it meant opposing views could be aired too. People trying to persuade each other through print. And it wasn't just print. Plays, songs, festivals.
Ways to communicate ideas to people who couldn't read.
Crucial ways. Grasping abstract ideas like liberty or justice, things philosophers wrote about, became easier through these popular, accessible forms. It was a democratization of information itself.
Okay, so we've seen the revolution's internal phases. Monarchy to republic, terror, the Directory. But its impact didn't stop at France's borders, did it? Napoleon enters the picture.
Right. That instability of the Directory allows Napoleon Bonaparte to rise. He stages a coup, eventually crowns himself emperor in 1804.
And sets out to conquer Europe.
Pretty much. He saw himself as a modernizer, though. He did introduce some lasting reforms, protecting private property, a uniform system of weights and measures based on the decimal system.
Was he seen as a liberator initially?
By some, yes, bringing revolutionary ideas, overthrowing old monarchies. But pretty soon, his armies were just seen as invaders, foreign occupation.
And he's eventually defeated.
Yes. Finally, at Waterloo in 1815, his empire collapses.
But the ideas of the revolution,
Hmm.
they lived on.
Absolutely. That's arguably the most important legacy. Liberty, democratic rights. These concepts spread across Europe in the 19th century.
Leading to changes elsewhere.
Yes, fueling movements that eventually abolished feudalism in other countries, and beyond Europe too.
Although,
Colonized peoples around the world heard these ideas, freedom from bondage, and reinterpreted them for their own struggles against colonial rule, for sovereign nation-states.
you give examples?
Sure, figures like Tipu Sultan in India or Ramohan Roy, they were directly inspired by these revolutionary French ideals. It lit sparks everywhere.
So it's quite a journey we've traced, from this deeply unequal society, crushed by debt,
To a nation proclaiming universal rights for all men,
then plunging into the terror, enforcing equality through fear.
followed by instability, the rise of Napoleon.
And yet through all that turmoil, these core ideas, liberty, equality, democracy, they somehow endured, spread, and inspired change across the globe.
They really did. Became touchstones for future struggles.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't
I
it?
think so.
If the revolution started with this bold declaration of natural rights for everyone, but then immediately excluded women, and took decades to even attempt, then reverse, then finally abolish slavery,
And if it led to both liberation and tyranny.
what does that whole complicated, messy, ongoing struggle actually tell us about what it takes to achieve real liberty and equality? For everyone, in any society, even thinking about our world today.
That's the thought to ponder, isn't it? The
Yeah.
gap between the ideal and the reality and the constant fight to close it.